It is not the restful silver silence of a snow-covered night, nor the contemplative velvet quiet of a deep cathedral. It is a hungry silence, a void. It is an absolute, predatory, and primordial null state. It is the sound of entropy itself, the roaring vacuum that exists in the infinite, maddening gulfs between the stars. Out here in the cold and the dark, the galaxy is a lightless ocean, a graveyard of dead sound and forgotten hope. The sheer unfeeling pressure of this emptiness presses in on all things, a constant reminder of oblivion. The Imperium of man, that sprawling, impossible, blood-soaked empire, claims 1,000,000 worlds, 1,000,000 points of flickering, defiant light, scattered like grains of sand in an endless, hostile desert. Each world is an island marooned. Each bastion of humanity, from the most overcrowded hive city to the most desolate agri-world, is a tiny, flickering candle, separated from its kin by an abyss of light years. This is a gulf so profound, so utterly vast, that it shatters the mortal mind that tries to comprehend it. A man born on the crowded, sacred, polluted soil of holy terror will live and die, and his children's children's children will live and die long before his physical form, even in the fastest of vessels, could ever hope to reach the distant forge worlds of the Segmentum Pacificus. His entire lineage from the first to the last would expire in the cold, timeless dark long before the journey was half complete. The void is the true unthinking enemy. It is a suffocating blanket of absolute isolation. It is the chasm that separates a father from a son, a regiment from its vital reinforcements, a desperate plea for help from the sword that would, if it only knew, answer. It is the medium of oblivion, the fundamental barrier to a unified mankind. It ensures that every victory is localized, every defeat is isolated, and every world is in its final moment utterly alone. There is no technology that can conquer this. Not anymore. The whispers of the dark age of technology, the myths of a golden age where information flowed like water and men conversed across the stars as if in the same room, are broken, forgotten, or declared the most profound techno-heresy. The electromagnetic spectrum, the entire domain of radio and light, is a child's toy in the face of this galactic immensity. A broadcast signal screaming with all the thermonuclear power of a dying star becomes a faint, pathetic whisper after a single light year. It is absorbed by roiling nebulae, warped by unseen gravity wells, and ultimately devoured by the sheer, crushing, abiotic blackness long before it reaches any meaningful destination. It is a shout into a hurricane, a message sent by a fleet of courier ships, their ancient temperamental warp engines, straining at the very edge of reality, would be a message delivered to ghosts. It would arrive centuries, perhaps millennia, too late. The civilization that sent it might be naught but radioactive dust, its great cities reduced to craters. The war it was meant to report would be a forgotten, unread footnote in the archaeology of a dead world, a puzzle for some future Adeptus Mechanicus Explorator team to ponder over before they too are lost. This is the fundamental, agonizing truth of the 1,000,000 worlds they are alone. Utterly, terrifyingly, hopelessly alone. The Imperium is a colossal body, a giant sprawling across the star-strewn map. But it is a body afflicted with a terrible cosmic palsy. Its limbs are so distant, so utterly separated by the cold void that they cannot feel each other. The head holy terror, the throne world, may issue a grand command, but how does the fist on the eastern fringe besieged by alien horrors know to clench? How does the heart, the segmentum solar, know when the foot on the segmentum obscurus has been pierced by the envenomed immaterial blade of the heretic? Without a nervous system, the giant is nothing. It is a paralyzed corpse, a banquet laid out waiting to be dissected by the 1,000 cackling horrors of the galaxy. It would shatter into 1,000,000 feudal empires, each unaware that the others even still exist, each falling one by one into the long final night. This is the silence. The endless, hollow, soul-crushing, and ultimately triumphant silence of the void. It is the natural state of the universe, and it is actively ceaselessly trying to reclaim the scattered defiant lights of mankind, pulling them back into the cold, quiet, eternal dark. And yet, the giant moves. Somehow, impossibly, the Imperium endures. The body ravaged as it is functions. The fist clenches. The armies march. The tithes are collected. The giant lives, it breathes, and it wages eternal, thankless war. How? It is not by copper wire. It is not by light speed wave. It is by will. It is by pure, focused, agonizing human will. It is by sacrifice, a sacrifice so profound, it is beyond the comprehension of the very citizens it saves. It is by a network forged not of metal and crystal, but of living, screaming, terrified souls. This is the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. They are the nervous system of the Imperium. They are the synapses, the ganglia, the fragile, vital, and eternally tormented connections that bind the million worlds into one single defiant, hateful entity. They are the blood that flows through the arteries of the void, carrying the commands of the head, the life-giving, soul-searing directives of the Emperor's will. They are the only bridge across the unbridgeable gulf. Their function is not merely important. It is the absolute prerequisite for survival. Without them, there is no Imperium. There is only anarchy. There is only isolation. There is only the inevitable creeping tide of extinction. The entire groaning, corrupt, and monumental edifice of imperial rule would collapse in a single generation. Every command from the High Lords of Terror robed in shadow and ancient inhuman power, every desperate, blood-flecked plea from a besieged planetary governor, his vox distorting with the screams of his people as his palace walls begin to crack. Every labyrinthine strategic redeployment of the Imperial Navy, shifting entire battle fleets across sectors to intercept a threat that will not fully manifest for another 50 years. Every fragmented, terrifying, half-mad warning of a new Xenos threat, a new heretical uprising, a new tear in the fabric of reality, it must all pass through them. They are the living conduits, the vessels of the Imperial word. The scale of this responsibility is absolute, crushing the minds that bear it. The fate of entire sectors of trillions of human lives rests not on the strength of their armies or the thickness of their fortress walls, but on the clarity of a single whispered thought. A thought sent from one tortured mind to another halfway across the galaxy, a thought that must scream its way through a hellscape of raw chaos just to be heard. A message delayed by a single hour, a single moment of psychic interference, could mean a relief fleet arriving to find only a charnel house, a world scoured clean of life, its populace already devoured and recycled by a tyrannid splinter fleet. A message distorted by the intervening chaos, its meaning subtly demonically twisted by a lurking intelligence, could turn a vital reinforcement into a friendly fire catastrophe. As brother turns his lasgun upon brother, convinced he is firing upon the tainted traitor. An order to hold at all costs becomes retreat and abandon. An order for exterminatus is accidentally delivered to the wrong world. A plea for aid that is simply lost a whisper, swallowed by the roaring psychic winds of the warp, condemns 1 billion souls to die in the dark, unheard, unknown, and unavenged. Their world becomes a ghost story, a record of a tithe unpaid, a mystery that will never be solved. They are the heralds of victory and the harbingers of doom. They are the unseen, unthanked, and utterly despised pillars that hold the entire groaning edifice of imperial power aloft. The administratum, with its mountains of parchment and oceans of ink, would grind to a halt without their constant stream of data. The ecclesiarchy, the state church, cannot spread the imperial creed to new worlds without their coordination. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, cannot wage its galaxy-spanning crusades without their vital, real-time intelligence. They are the most vital, the most crucial, the most utterly indispensable asset in mankind's desperate, unending war for survival. The lifeblood of the Empire flows through their minds, and that blood is a poisoned torrent of information, of fear of commands, and of unimaginable, unceasing pain. But when you think of this vital, irreplaceable link, do not picture a hero. Erase from your mind the image of a proud herald, clad in shining auramite armor bearing the Emperor's scroll. Do not imagine a noble scholar, his brow furrowed in concentration, wisely interpreting the strands of fate. Do not even picture a grim-faced warrior, his jaw set in resolution. Picture instead a tool, a biological instrument, a specialized living, breathing, suffering piece of equipment designed for one purpose and one purpose only. Picture a thing that was once perhaps a child, a thing that was once long ago a person with a name, a family, and a home. See it if your stomach can bear the sight. See the astropath. See it chained. They are always chained. See it locked within the cold, resonant humming copper of a choir chamber, a room built not for comfort, but as an antenna, a psychic resonance chamber designed to amplify the faintest whispers of the soul. It is a tomb they live inside. The body is a ruin. It is a mockery. It is a desiccated husk, a grotesque, withered parody of the human form, consumed from within day by the very energies it was forged and broken to channel. The limbs are atrophied skeletal twigs that hang uselessly like a broken marionettes from a blackened iron cruciform harness. This frame is necessary. The astropath no longer possesses the strength to sit, let alone stand. Its muscles have been devoured by its own power, its tissues wasted away, leaving only pale gray, waxy skin stretched like yellowed, damp parchment over a brittle, prominent cage of bones. The head lolls tethered by a web of humming cables, glistening nutrient tubes and waste pipes. The hair is long gone, sloughed off in bloody, weeping clumps decades ago, a minor casualty of the constant invisible psychic radiation that bathes it, a radiation that is the byproduct of its own agonizing function. And the eyes. Oh, the eyes. The eyes are the seal of their office, the mark of their damnation, the physical price of their terrible sight. They are gone. They are not merely closed. They are not simply blind. They are ruined. They are hollow, weeping, puckered sockets, the ocular nerves, and vitreous humor boiled away in a single, agonizing flash, burned out from within by a power no mortal orb was ever meant to witness. Sometimes they are jagged, scorched craters. Sometimes they are scarred over flaps of flesh, sewn shut by a chirurgeon's crude, unsterilized needle. Always they are a testament to the price that must be paid. This is the uniform. This is the badge of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. They are the soul-blind, the seers of the dark, their physical sight obliterated in exchange for a terrible, agonizing inner vision that shows them only the horrors of the Imperium and the screaming souls of mankind. This existence is not a choice. It is not a calling one aspires to. It is a sentence passed down upon them the moment their cursed psychic potential first flickered to life, marking them as different as wrong as a witch to be feared and hunted. Their life is an unbroken, monotonous, and meticulously managed symphony of agony. It is a continuous, systematic torment that begins with the terror of their discovery is codified by the soul-shattering horror of their initiation and is practiced daily, hourly in their servitude. It is a life that will only end when the last spark of their soul, the very essence of their being, is finally mercifully incinerated by the strain. They will burn out from the inside, a psychic fuse blown their mind snapping like a frayed cable until they are just another charred, silent corpse to be unclipped from the harness, discarded in a reclamation chute, and immediately replaced by another. A new, fresh, terrified soul ready to be burned in its turn. They are the ultimate anonymous sacrifice offered up in their millions day after day, year after year, upon the cold, uncaring, and insatiable altar of imperial necessity. They are the living dead, the damned who bring salvation, the tortured tools that hold the fragile, crumbling galaxy together. Their torment is the price of connection. Their suffering is the fuel that keeps the light of the Imperium from being extinguished for just one more day. And it is endless. It does not begin as a conscious act. It is not a power to be summoned, but a sickness that takes root, a cancer of the soul. On the agri-world of Surfos 7, a planet of endless rust-colored fields and choking, humid skies, a child lived. Her world until this moment had been defined by the drone of harvester engines, the rhythmic ringing of the hydrostation bells, the smell of wet soil, and the comforting, ignorant simplicity of the Imperial Creed, chanted by rote at dawn and dusk. Life was hard, life was short, but it was predictable. Then the whispers began. At first she mistook it for a fever. A pressure behind her eyes, a strange metallic taste in her mouth. She started to hear the world in a new, sickening key. It was not sound. It was the shape of things. She could feel the silent, bitter resentment her mother held for her father, a feeling as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She could feel the dull, bovine stupidity of the groks in their pen, a mud-thick wave of simple, sluggish sensation. She would clutch her head, weeping, trying to block out the screaming, silent noise of a billion tiny insects burrowing in the fields, a sound like a tide of tiny clicking needles. She was 9 years old. Her name did not matter. It would be forgotten. The first true nightmare was the end of her life. She did not dream of beasts or falling, but of a color that should not exist, a swirling, oily, purple-green vortex that looked back at her. She felt it see her. She felt it reach for her. She screamed a raw physical sound that ripped through the thin walls of their homestead. She woke up to a new kind of silence. Her father was staring at her, his face a mask of bone-white, slack-jawed terror. Her mother was frozen by the hearth, her hand over her mouth. In the corner, the wooden cask of fresh milk delivered only an hour before was not just sour. It was boiling a thick green-black foam, bubbling over the rim and sizzling on the floorboards, releasing a stench like burned hair and ozone. The small tray of dried meats on the table, their rations for the week, was covered in a carpet of pulsating, velvety black mold that grew even as they watched. But that was not the worst of it. You were in my head." Her father whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. You know, she did. In that single terrible flash of the nightmare, she had accidentally fallen into his mind. She had seen his secret, disgusting, and petty thoughts about the overseer's wife. She had seen his private fear of the harvest tithe. She had seen his hatred for his own life, and he knew that she had seen it. He looked at her not as his daughter, but as a violation, a spy, a thing that had burrowed into his skull and seen the filth within. It took less than an hour for the word to spread. Witch. It was her father who bolted the door to her small room from the outside. It was her mother who, weeping and chanting prayers to the god emperor, pushed rags into the gaps under the door as if to contain a plague. When the local enforcer, a burly man named Hask, who also served as the lay preacher, arrived, he was not alone. He was flanked by a dozen other field workers, their faces grim, their eyes wide with the intoxicating, unifying terror of superstition. They carried scythes, heavy-duty flensing knives, and rusty single-shot stubbers. They were not here for an arrest. They were here for a cleansing. The girl, Hask said, his voice a low growl. She has blighted the rations. The Thane's milk is spoiled. She has the taint. The girl's mother collapsed a wailing heap, but did not protest. Her father, his face as pale and hard as chipped flint, stepped back from the house and pointed a shaking finger at the bolted door of his daughter's room. It was an act of complete and total abdication. An offering. They smashed the door open. She ran. She scrambled out the small window and fled into the rust-colored fields she had spent her entire life helping to tend. The hunt was immediate. The sky was a sickly yellow, the air thick with humidity and the smell of fear. She could hear them crashing through the grain behind her, their shouts echoing across the plains. Witch-spawn abomination, burn the taint. She could feel their minds. They were not just angry, they was afraid. Their fear was a scalding, righteous fire. They believed with all the fervor of the truly ignorant that she was a monster, a doorway for the demons they heard about in Hask's screaming sermons. They believed that by killing her, they were saving their own souls. She stumbled, her small lungs burning. She looked back and saw her father in the mob. His face averted, but he was there. He was part of the hunt. There was no help. There was no sanctuary. The family that had raised her had cast her out. The community she belonged to now wanted her dead. The very ground she ran on felt alien and hostile. She was 9 years old, and she was utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone, a cursed thing running from the only home she had ever known. She did not know what the warp was. She did not know the word psyker. She only knew one horrifying, fundamental truth of the Imperium: to be different was to be damned. And for a sin she did not understand, she was being hunted like an animal. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. She had reached the edge of a great, muddy irrigation trench, a dead end. The shouts were closer now, a chorus of hateful, frightened voices. Hask the Enforcer was bellowing the litanies of purity. She turned her small body, trembling, her bare feet sinking into the wet, dark soil. The mob of farmers led by her father and the Enforcer crested the low hill, their scythes and stubbers silhouetted against the sickly yellow sky. They had her. They had found the witch. They stopped. It was not a gradual halt. The entire mob froze as one, their shouts dying in their throats, their righteous fury evaporating into a new, colder, and far deeper dread. The farmer who had been beside her father dropped his flensing knife. It made no sound when it hit the soft earth. Silence. Not the silence of the void, but a heavy, imposed, crushing quiet. The drone of the distant harvesters had ceased. The perpetual wind that swept across the plains of Sophos VII had died. Even the clicking of the insects in the grain was gone. The world had become a dead, soundless diorama, and the light was wrong. Something was blotting out the sun. It was not a cloud, it was a shape. A hard, geometric, impossible void of perfect, light-devouring black. It hung in the upper atmosphere, a dagger of pure obsidian aimed at the heart of their small community. It had no lights. It had no signals. It made no sound. It did not roar with orbital insertion. It was simply there. It was a presence so vast, so ancient, and so utterly alien that the simple, superstitious minds of the farmers could not process it. This was not a local demon. This was a god of terror from their darkest legends. This was the vengeance of the Imperium itself. Hask the Imperium fell to his knees, his stubber clattering to the ground. He began to pray, but the words came out as a dry, choked whisper. The child felt it too. But for her it was worse. The swirling, nascent chaos in her mind, the whispers, and the pressure that had plagued her were suddenly violently stilled. A new, far greater terror replaced it. From the impossible silent ship, a single, smaller shape detached. It fell not with the fire of a drop pod, but with the lazy, terrifying grace of a falling leaf. It was a gunship, its hull the same matte, lightless black. It did not land. It hovered a dozen meters above the field, its engines emitting only the barest subsonic thrum. A ramp descended. Out of the darkness within they came. They were armored, but it was not the crude flak plate of the local enforcers or the green-grey steel of the Astra Militarum. It was burnished, archaic Baroque bronze, inlaid with sigils of judgment. They wore great cloaks, the color of dried blood, and they were silent. They were the Sisters of Silence. The mob did not move. They could not. They were paralyzed by what they felt. As the bronze-clad figures stepped onto the soil of Sophos VII, they brought their own atmosphere with them. It was a coldness, a hollowing. It was the feeling of a graveyard at midnight, the taste of ash in the mouth, the profound psychic emptiness of a soulless place. To the normal farmers like the child's father and Hask, it was a crawling, visceral wrongness. The prayers on their lips felt false, the the divine protection of the Emperor suddenly terrifyingly distant. They felt an instinctive animal revulsion, a desire to flee from these figures, who felt in a way they could not name, fundamentally empty. They were a void in human form, but for the child it was an agony beyond comprehension. The nascent, terrible power inside her, the taint the farmers so feared, was a fire. These women were a vacuum. As they approached, the child did not just feel fear. She felt her very soul being siphoned. The whispers in her head did not just stop. They were violently ripped out. The pressure behind her eyes became a blinding cold spike, as if iron pokers frozen to absolute zero were being driven into her skull. She collapsed, writhing in the mud, screaming a new, far more terrible sound. It was a pain that made the thought of the mob's scythes feel like a gentle mercy. This was the pariah gene. This was the anathema. This was the soulless cold that was the only counter to the fires of the witch. A sister, her face a mask of cold, aristocratic disdain, beneath a plumed helmet glided towards the paralyzed mob. She did not look at Hask, who was gibbering on the ground. She stopped in front of the child's father. He could not speak. He could not even meet her gaze. He simply desperately pointed a shaking finger at his own daughter, still screaming and convulsing in the mud. The sister did not acknowledge him. She did not acknowledge the gesture. She looked at him as if he were a piece of fungi, a complex mold, an irrelevant part of the landscape. She simply turned her head, her bronze helm catching the sickly light, and looked at the child. With a single economical gesture, she signaled to two other sisters. They moved forward, their tread silent and purposeful. They did not speak. They did not offer comfort, nor did they issue threats. They were collecting a resource. One of them produced a set of heavy iron manacles etched with glowing blue-white runes that pulsed with a cold, suppressive energy. The child was too weak to resist her mind, and body shattered by the proximity of the blanks. The sister clamped the manacles onto her thin, muddy wrists. The clack of the metal locking into place was the loudest sound in the field. Instantly, the cold, siphoning pain lessened, replaced by a dull, deadening throb from the manacles themselves. The child's screams subsided into a choked, hopeless sobbing. She was hauled to her feet, a piece of cargo, and dragged toward the gunship. She looked back one last time. She saw her father. His face was no longer terrified. It was not sad. It was relieved. A great, unholy burden had been lifted from his life. He watched his daughter, his own blood being taken by the silent, bronze-clad monsters, and he felt only the profound, selfish relief of the survivor. The child was not the only one. The gunship's ramp remained open. The sisters moved with grim, silent efficiency through the small settlement. They ignored the enforcers, they ignored the local hierarchy. They moved to a small, isolated hut and emerged dragging a crone, an old woman whose eyes were white with cataracts, who had been muttering prophecies about the harvest for years. They took her. They moved to the home of the overseer and took his youngest son, a quiet, brooding boy of 16, who had a strange affinity for animals. They took him. From the settlement of barely 1,000 souls, they reaped their tithe of 3. The child, the boy, and the old woman were thrown into the back of the gunship. They were not restrained further. The presence of the sisters was a cage more effective than any steel. The ramp sealed, plunging them into absolute, terrifying darkness. The farmers on the field watched as the gunship rose without sound, a black spear ascending to the greater geometric shadow that still eclipsed their sun. And then, as if it had never been, the great ship in the sky vanished. It did not streak into the void. It simply ceased to be. The sun's yellow, oppressive light returned. The wind began to blow again, rustling the grain. The insects resumed their clicking, but the farmers did not move for a long time. Hask the enforcer finally pushed himself to his feet, his face pale and clammy. He looked at the child's father, who turned and began the long, silent walk back to his empty, undefiled homestead. There were no words. There was no celebration of the witch's removal. There was only the cold, scoured feeling of having been touched by something vast, uncaring, and absolute. And in the dark, cold, silent hold of the gunship, now docking with the black ship in orbit, the child wept her journey into the endless night just beginning. There was no light. There was no day or night. There was only the cold steel floor, the perpetual subsonic thrum of the great ship's engines, and the smell. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of excrement, of stale, terrified sweat, and something else, a sharp electric coppery odor like ozone and old blood. It was the smell of fear itself made manifest. The child from Sophos 7th, whose name was already a fading, irrelevant echo in her own mind, was no longer just with the boy and the old woman. She was one of thousands. The black ship was a cathedral of collection. Its primary holds were not cargo bays, but human warehouses, vast cavernous spaces stretching for kilometers within the vessel's structure. They were titanic, unlit chambers, tiered with metal shelves and cages crammed with the psychic tithe of an entire imperial sector. Men, women, and children, thousands upon thousands of them, drawn from hive worlds, forge worlds, feudal worlds, and primitive death worlds. They were all here, a weeping, shivering, terrified mass of cursed humanity. The air was a psychic slurry, a toxic soup of raw, unfiltered emotion. The child could feel it all. She felt the stark, raving terror of a hive ganger who had seen his family gunned down by arbitrators. She felt the senile, looping confusion of an old nobleman who thought he was still in his palace. She felt the animalistic panic of a feral world shaman who had never seen metal before. And she felt the nightmares. They were constant. The air was thick with them. In the dark, 1,000 minds screamed at once, leaking their terrors into the shared space. Dreams of falling, of being eaten, of drowning in oceans of blood, of faces melting like wax. These psychic emanations became a shared reality, a suffocating hallucinatory fog that clung to everyone. A man would suddenly scream, clawing at his own face, convinced that spiders were burrowing into his eyes, and the sheer focused terror of his vision would infect the minds of those nearest to him, who would also begin to scream and swat at imaginary horrors. There was no escape from the noise inside or out. The darkness was alive with sobbing, with muttered prayers to an emperor who was clearly not listening, with sudden sharp shrieks, and with the low, constant keening moan of collective despair. It was the sound of a slaughterhouse heard from the inside. Then the ship jumped. There was no physical lurch. It was a sensation that defied physics. It was a lurch of the soul, a sickening, violent, non-physical twist. The subsonic thrum of the engines was replaced by a new sound, a sound that was not a sound but a feeling, a nauseating, discordant, screaming howl that seemed to come from inside their own bones. The ship had entered the Imperium. It had plunged into the raw chaos of the warp. For the soulless Sisters of Silence, this was merely a void, a nothingness they passed through. For a normal, non-psychic human, the Geller field, the flickering, wafer-thin bubble of imperial reality that protected the ship, would be enough to shield them from the worst of it, leaving only a vague unease and terrible dreams. But for the Psychers, the Geller field was a permeable membrane, a flawed filter. They were attuned to this place. They were beacons of light in an ocean of infinite hungry darkness. The child felt them instantly. The things outside. They were not just figments of nightmares, they were the source of nightmares. They were intelligences vast, ancient, and utterly malevolent. She could feel them brushing against the hull like whales rubbing against a tiny, fragile boat. They were drawn to the concentrated, terrified psychic energy of the hold, like predators drawn to the scent of blood in the water. She could feel them crawling on the Git Param's field, testing it, searching for the slightest crack. She could hear their voices not as words, but as injected instantaneous temptations and blasphemies. They whispered promises of power, of freedom, of an end to the pain. They showed her visions of her father being flayed alive, and whispered that she could have stopped it if only she were stronger. They showed her the faces of the bronze-clad sisters and whispered of the exquisite revenge she could exact if only she would let them in. The old crone from her village began to laugh, a high-pitched rattling cackle. "He sees us!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, "the Lord of Flies. He brings his gifts, he brings his blessings." She began to scratch at her own skin, tearing away strips of flesh, welcoming a decay that was not yet there. The hold descended into sheer, screaming pandemonium. The psychic pressure was unbearable. Minds already strained by terror and grief began to snap. A dozen psykers in one corner began to chant in a language that had never been spoken by human tongues, their bodies convulsing in unison. A man in another tier simply burst his head, exploding in a shower of gore and psychic lightning as he failed to contain the pressure. This was the true purpose of the Sisters of Silence on the voyage. This was not a passenger transport. It was a prison convoy moving through hostile territory, and the prisoners were the ammunition. A section of the hold's non-existent lighting flickered on, casting a cold, sterile, blue-white glare over a patch of the floor. A heavy armored door hissed open, and the sisters glided in. The effect was instantaneous. Their aura of psychic nullness, the pariah cold, washed over the hold. For most, it was a momentary, agonizing relief, like plunging a burned hand into ice water. The voices of the warp entities were momentarily stifled, their presence recoiling from the soulless void. But the sisters were not here to comfort. They were here to cull. The old cackling crone, still laughing and tearing at her flesh, was the first to be judged. A sister with a great two-handed executioner's blade, a weapon that seemed to drink the very light from the air, approached her. The crone spat a stream of black bile, her eyes rolling back to show only the whites. "You are nothing. We are the chosen." The sister did not speak. Her blade hissed through the air in a single, silent, flawless arc. The crone's head, her laughter cut off, mid-cackle tumbled onto the metal deck. The body stood twitching for a second longer before collapsing. The chanting group in the corner fell silent, clutching their heads as the soulless aura washed over them. But it was too late. The taint was upon them. The sisters moved in their bronze armor gleaming in the cold light, their great swords rising and falling with the relentless impersonal efficiency of an abattoir's machinery. They did not shout. They did not utter battle cries. There was only the wet, heavy sound of blades on flesh and bone and the sudden choked-off screams of the purged. This was the routine. The journey to Terra was not measured in days, but in jumps through the warp, and each jump was a new test of sanity. And between the jumps in the cold, dark, real space, the horror continued in a different key. Despair was a physical currency. The stronger psychers, those with a more potent predatory instinct, began to understand, even if unconsciously. The child watched as the quiet, brooding boy from her village, the one who loved animals, grew paler and more distant. He would sit near a younger child, a small boy from a hive world who did nothing but weep. After hours of this, the weeping boy would grow quiet, his breathing shallow. The older boy in turn would seem more robust, his eyes clearer. He was, without knowing it, feeding. He was siphoning the weak psychic echo of the child next to him, draining his life to sustain his own. It was a desperate, unintentional psychic cannibalism. The sisters did not stop this. It was part of the process. The strong survived. The weak were consumed one way or another. The child learned to hide. She learned to make her mind small. She huddled in a dark corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her ruined manacles a source of dull, painful comfort. She tried to become nothing, to project no fear, no hope, no thought. She focused on the cold metal floor, the thrum of the engines, the physical reality trying to anchor herself against the psychic tide of the hold, and the scratching, whispering madness of the warp outside. She watched the weak die. She watched the tainted be purged. She watched the strong consume the desperate. She learned the first and most important lesson of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica: your soul is not your own. It is a resource, it is a weapon, and it is a curse. When the ship finally agonizingly twisted back into real space for the last time, the overwhelming psychic sun of the Emperor's light flooding the senses, the hold was half empty. Thousands were dead. They had died from madness from the sisters' blades, from terror-induced heart failure, or from being slowly psychically bled dry by their neighbors. The child had survived. She had made herself small and hard, a tiny, cold pebble in an ocean of screaming. She was no longer a child. She was cargo. Damaged, terrified, but viable cargo. And she had arrived at the one place in the galaxy, more terrifying than the ship that had brought her. She had arrived at Holy Terra. They were blinded by the light. Not the light of a natural sun. Terra's sky was a poisoned, smog-choked industrial haze, but the artificial, overwhelming billion-watt glare of the Imperial Palace. As the great seals of the black ship's holds cracked open, venting the stale air of 100 tormented souls, the survivors were herded out by silent gun servitors. They stumbled onto a landing platform so vast it resembled a small continent of dark iron. The sheer scale of the world around them was an act of violence. The air was thick with the taste of burned promethium, ancient incense, and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. Above them, the palace blotted out the sky. It was not a building. It was a mountain range of gold, basalt, and marble, a sprawling, impossible conglomeration of fortresses, cathedrals, and spires that climbed so high they vanished into the orbital smog. The weight of so much humanity, so much history and power was a physical pressure, a psychic roar that dwarfed the screams of the hold. They were marched a column of filthy, emaciated, and soul-shocked ghosts, still bound by their ruined manacles. They walked through canyons of architecture, past towering statues of forgotten heroes under the gaze of gargoyles, whose stone eyes seemed to weep black tears of pollution. Their destination was a spire that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was a needle of black, windowless stone, humming with a power that made their teeth ache. This was the Tower of the Lost, the headquarters of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the first and final stop for their kind. The interior was a single cavernous hall, cold as a tomb, and vast as a stadium. The floor was polished obsidian reflecting the thousands of new tithes like ripples in a dark, still lake. They were forced into dozens of shuffling, silent lines. The hollow, deadening aura of the Sisters of Silence was everywhere a permanent, stifling blanket. At the head of each line sat the arbiters of their fate. They were not a single group. Some were robed senior astropaths, their own withered bodies barely visible within complex life support thrones, their blinded eyes covered by silken bands. Others were grim, unsmiling inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus, their black carapaces marked with the sigil of the witch hunter, their faces scarred and impatient. Beside each one stood a heavily armed Greyfax pattern servitor, its multi-barreled weapon aimed squarely at the line. The process was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. There were no questions, there were no pleas, there was no mercy. A group of 10 tithes would be shoved forward. The Inquisitor or the senior telepath would simply look. For the child from Sophos VII, the moment came. She was pushed forward, stumbling onto a marked circle on the floor. She looked up at the figure on the dais. It was one of the telepaths, a woman so ancient and desiccated, she looked more like a corpse than a living being, her form fused with a throne of buzzing, arcane machinery. The child felt a sudden, piercing mental intrusion. It was not a voice. It was a scalpel. It sliced into her mind, laid bare her memories of the field, the hunt, the black ship, the boy who fed on the weak. It weighed her fear, measured her nascent, uncontrolled power, and judged the texture of her soul. The violation lasted less than a second. The withered telepath's skeletal fingers twitched. A single bony index finger pointed to the left. A servitor grabbed the child by the arm, its metal claws bruising her flesh, and shoved her into a new, smaller group. A few meters away, the brooding boy from her village was brought before an inquisitor. The man, his face a web of scar tissue, barely glanced at him. The inquisitor's mental probe was not a scalpel, it was a hammer. The boy winced. The inquisitor sneered a flicker of disgust. He pointed to the right. This was the Great Culling, the binary final judgment. The child watched as the group on the right grew. It was vast. The brooding boy was there. The man who had screamed about spiders was there. The young mother who had done nothing but silently weep for her own lost children was there. Easily 9/10 of the survivors from the Black Ship, thousands of souls who had endured the horror of the journey, were herded into this massive, doomed congregation. They were the unusable, the taint positive, the unstable, the weak. They were the ones whose minds had been broken, or whose power was too volatile, or who simply weren't strong enough to be useful. An iron portcullis, large as a cathedral gate, groaned open, revealing a dark, cavernous tunnel. Armed enforcers and more servitors, their weapons hot, began to herd the massive group on the right towards it. There was no explanation. A few began to panic, to ask questions. A single burst from a servitor's heavy stubber turned one questioning man into a red mist, and the panic subsided into a numbed, shuffling obedience. They were being taken to their final destination. They were the true primary tithe. They were not destined for training. They were destined for the sanctum imperialis, for the great consuming, life-giving hunger of the golden throne itself. Their journey was over. They were fuel. Their souls would be offered up not as a prayer, but as kindling rendered down in a final collective, agonizing scream to provide a single drop of sustenance, a single second of life for the dying master of mankind. Their death would be swift, absolute, and unremembered. The child stood in the much, much smaller group on the left. She looked at the faces around her. They were the ones who had hidden, the ones who had endured, the ones like her who had made themselves small and hard. A robed adept, his face pale and emotionless, approached their small group. He carried no weapon, only a data slate. "You," he intoned, his voice as dry as dust. "You are the fortunate. You have been judged viable. You have been found worthy of his notice. You will not be rendered today. The God Emperor has a greater, longer service in mind for you." He gestured towards a different, smaller, but no less ominous doorway. The child from Sophos VII felt no relief. She felt no gratitude. She felt nothing but a cold, hollowing dread. She had watched the thousands being marched to their quick, fiery oblivion. She knew with a certainty that settled in her bones that she had not been saved. She had merely been selected. She was not the fuel. She was the tool. And the process of her forging a torment far longer and more terrible than a simple, clean execution was about to begin. Her death sentence had not been commuted. It had only been refined. There were no more names. The child from Sophos VII, the girl who had hidden her mind and made herself small, was now known only as Initiate 7741 Delta. Her name passed her parents, the smell of the rust-colored fields, all of it was contraband. To think of one's past was an indulgence. To speak of it was heresy. She and the other fortunate survivors of the culling were marched from the Tower of the Lost, deep into the lightless subterranean warrens that honeycombed the rock of terror beneath the imperial palace. This was the Scholastia Sicana. It was not a school but a forge that burned away weakness, personality, and hope, leaving only a tempered, obedient tool. The years that followed were a grey, monotonous blur of pain and indoctrination. There was no day or night, only the cycle of the bells. The bell of waking which roused them from their cramped stone sleep cells. The bell of sustenance which summoned them to the refectories for a thin grey nutrient paste eaten in enforced silence. The bell of instruction. The bell of purification. The bell of rest. A life measured not in time, but in duties. Their education was not one of empowerment. It was the opposite. It was a systematic, brutal dismantling of the self designed to instill absolute control and unquestioning obedience. The first lessons were purely doctrinal. For 10 hours a day, they sat in vast, tiered lecture halls, the air cold and damp. Robed adepts, their voices amplified by crackling voxcasters, drilled the imperial creed into their minds. But this was not the comforting, simple creed of the masses. This was a specialized, terrifying version. Your power is not a gift, the adept would drone his voice echoing from the stone walls. It is a mutation. It is a flaw. It is the signature of the unclean, the mark of the witch, the very sin for which you are damned. The initiates, thousands of them, would chant back in a dull, terrified monotone. Our power is our sin. The warp from which you draw this sin is not a well of power, the adept continued. It is an ocean of damnation. It is the domain of the great enemy, the demon, the lurker at the threshold. To touch it is to be tainted. To swim in it is to be consumed. The warp is the enemy. You are born damned. You live in peril. Your very thoughts are a beacon for the predator. Your soul is a gateway for the demonic. Left to yourselves, you would be nothing but a screaming portal for the ruin of your world. Our souls are the gateway to ruin. But there is one and only one path to salvation. It is not redemption, for you are irredeemable. It is service. It is obedience. It is the surrender of your flawed, tainted, and worthless will to the divine, sanctified will of the God Emperor. He is your shield. He is your master. To obey is to be pure. To question is to be heretic. To fail is to be damned. Obedience is our only salvation. This was hammered into them hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It was reinforced by auto-hypnotic suggestion, piped into their cells as they slept. It was written in stark, glowing runes on every wall. Their sin was their nature. Their only purpose was to serve. Their only hope was to be controlled. The second part of their training was the iron discipline of the mind. This was where the weak were truly broken. Initiate 7741 Delta stood in a chamber known as the Cauldron of Echoes. She and 100 other initiates stood barefoot on a copper floor, chilled to near freezing. In the center, a captured Psyker One who had failed or rebelled was strapped to a post. He was a howler. You will shield your minds, the presiding telepath commanded his own mind, a cold, hard presence. A switch was thrown. Psychic dampeners around the howler were dropped. The man, driven insane by his own uncontrolled power, unleashed a psychic scream. It was not a sound. It was a wave of pure, condensed agony. 741 Delta felt it slam into her, a vision of her skin being peeled from her body, the smell of her own burning fat, the terror of her father's mob. She fought it. As she had been taught, she built a wall in her mind. She visualized a fortress of black iron slamming a gate shut against the tide of pain. The initiate next to her, a boy from a forge world, was not fast enough. His eyes rolled back, and he began to scream, echoing the howler's vision. A Greyfax servitor, its multi-laser whining pivoted. A single precise beam lanced out. The boy's head vanished in a cloud of vaporized blood and bone. His body collapsed, smoking. Failure is death. The telepath stated, his mental voice calm. The shield of another is your own. The weak mind invites damnation not only upon itself, but upon its brothers. You will hold. You will focus. Or you will be purged. The howler continued to scream for an hour. 2 more initiates were purged. 7741 Delta held. Her metaphorical iron wall was cracked and dented, but it held. She learned to feed her fear not into panic, but into the cold, hard mortar of her defenses. They were forced to meditate for days without food, maintaining a single pure thought, while adepts projected whispers of doubt, fear, and blasphemy directly into their minds. They were forced to trace complex psychic circuits with their minds, where a single misaligned thought would result in agonizing neural feedback that felt like fire ants crawling through their nervous system. Failure did not always mean death. Sometimes it meant a fate far worse. An initiate who had consistently failed to shield but was physically strong was dragged from the line. He was taken to the chirurgeon vaults. He returned a week later. His eyes were gone, replaced by glowing bionic lenses. His personality was gone, his brain surgically and chemically wiped clean. His arms had been replaced with heavy-duty lifting claws. He was now a servitor destined to spend the rest of his biological life loading nutrient paste onto carts, his gaze empty, his soul extinguished. He was a walking constant reminder of the price of mediocrity. The final stage was the dissolution of the self. They were no longer 7741 Delta 6219 Gamma or 3308 Epsilon. They were a single cohort. They were taught to think in unison. The individual is weak, the adepts taught them. The individual mind is a candle in a hurricane. It is arrogant, it is vulnerable. The choir is strong. The choir is a fortress. You will learn to surrender your I for the we. They were linked together a dozen at a time, their minds connected by humming arcane apparatus. They were given a single complex concept to hold, such as the Emperor's divine right to rule. They had to hold it in perfect unison. If one mind's concept was tinged with fear, the entire group was punished, submerged in tanks of ice-cold, foul-smelling water. If one mind's concept was tinged with pride, the group was scourged with psychic feedback. 7741 Delta learned to erase herself. She learned to blend her thoughts, to strip them of all personal flavor, all emotion, all identity, until her mind was a single, clear, compatible note, ready to harmonize with the others. She ceased to be a person. She became a component. Her memories of Sophus VII's of her father's betrayal were not forgotten. They were simply encapsulated, locked away in a dark corner of her mind, a part of herself that she no longer had permission to access. After a decade of this, the forge was done. Initiate 7741 Delta was unrecognizable. The child was dead. In her place was a pale, gaunt, and utterly disciplined vessel. Her mind was a fortress of black iron. Her will was not her own. She was no longer a she. She was an it. A tool honed, tempered, and stripped of all impurities, waiting for the final, terrible step. She was ready for the fire. She was ready for the soul binding. After a decade buried in dungeons, in cloisters of stone and steel, where their minds were forged in pain and obedience, they were brought up. Initiate 7741 Delta. Now a gaunt, hollow-eyed young woman was herded with thousands of others through corridors no longer made of raw rock, but of polished marble and brass. They were brought to a place the adepts called the Chamber of Resonance. It was different from the torture rooms and lecture halls of the Scholastia. This room was not designed to contain or to punish. It was designed to receive. Its vast domed ceiling was inlaid with golden psi circuitry, all of it converging on a single massive black crystal suspended in the center. "You have been forged," an abbot telepath announced, his voice crackling from a hovering vox cherub. "You have been taught to shield. You have built fortresses in your souls. Today you will be ordered to lower the gates." A chill of pure, conditioned terror ran through the ranks. Lower the gates, that was death. That was possession. That was failure. "Silence," the abbot's voice boomed. "You will not open yourselves to the enemy. You will open yourselves to him. For 10 years you have been shielded from his light, lest you be incinerated before you were prepared. Now you will listen. For the first time you will truly hear the call of the Astronomicon." The abbot gestured. A low, resonant, thrumming sound filled the air as the black crystal in the center began to glow with an inner light. The vast psychic dampeners that shielded the cloister were lowered. It came. It was not a sound. It was a pressure, a psychic tsunami, a detonation of pure will and power that slammed into their minds. 741 Delta fell to her knees, clutching her shaven head, a hiss of agony escaping through her clenched teeth. This was the Emperor's psychic beacon. And it was madness. It was not a harmonious melody. It was a roar. It was the unified, eternal eternal compound scream of the 10,000 psychers sacrificed to it every single day, their souls burned away to fuel the great fire. It was a choir of 1 billion souls, a psychic firestorm of sacrifice, of agony, and of an indomitable iron, will all focused and amplified by the vast, dying mind of the Emperor himself. It was a sun, a blinding, incinerating psychic sun, and 77 Forum. Delta felt the fortress of black iron in her mind, the one she had spent a decade building, begin to crack and melt like wax under its heat. It hurt. It hurt with an unimaginable conceptual agony. It was a roaring command for obedience, a judgmental light that seared away all shadow, all secrecy, all individuality. This was the thing they had to bind themselves to, not as a friend, but as a moth to a furnace. They had to withstand it, attune their minds to this great roaring gale, and not be shattered. Many failed. A man 2 rows over screamed, blood pouring from his eyes, ears, and nose. He had tried to block it, a reflexive, defensive act. The pressure of the Astronomicon meeting a rigid wall had simply shattered his mind like a hammer hitting a gourd. Servitors immediately moved in to drag the convulsing corpse away. 7741 Delta obeyed. She lowered her gates. She let the firestorm wash through her, and she used every ounce of her will not to fight it, but to bend with it, to become a reed in the storm, bending but not breaking. After an hour, the shields were raised. The room was silent again, save for the gasping, quiet sobs of the survivors. They had been given a taste of the Emperor's power, and it was absolute terror. The next phase began immediately, the mandatory purity. If they were to become vessels for even a single drop of that fiery ocean, they had to be utterly empty. Their bodies and minds had to be brought to their most receptive state, and therefore their most vulnerable. They were stripped of their tattered grey Scholastia uniforms. Their hair, what little had regrown, was shaved away. They were submerged in vats of ice-cold water infused with acrid ritual oils that smelled of ammonia and incense, scrubbed by wire-brush-wielding servitors until their skin was raw and weeping. They were forced to fast. Their meager rations were cut to a thin vegetable broth, then to water, and then to nothing. For weeks their bodies consumed themselves. They became weak, gaunt, paper-thin. The physical starvation dulled their senses, put them in a half-waking dream state, weakening their physical mind's grip on their soul, and they prayed. They were locked in prayer cells, kneeling on cold stone, and they chanted. They chanted the litanies of emptiness, the litanies of obedience, the litanies of sacrifice. They chanted for dozens of hours at a time, until their voices were raw and their throats bled. The purpose was not communion. The purpose was to fatigue the conscious mind, to break the patterns of thought, to render their brains into a blank, exhausted slate, ready to be written upon by the Emperor's fire. The great brass gates were fully open. They revealed not a room, but a void that pulsed with golden, agonizing light. The heat was not a temperature. It was a psychic wave, a physical crushing presence that forced the very air from their lungs. The roar of the Astronomicon, which they had heard in the Chamber of Resonance, was a distant echo compared to this. This was the sound of the furnace itself. This was the heartbeat of the Imperium, a sledgehammer blow resonating 1,000 times a second. Forward, the adepts commanded their voices barely audible over the psychic din. Initiate 7741 Delta, along with the thousands of other white-robed, emaciated candidates, walked. They did not march. They shuffled a ghostly procession of the damned, stepping from the cold, white marble of the waiting hall into the very heart of the storm. This was not the throne room. That sacred final place was kilometers distant, shielded by adamantium blast doors 100 meters thick, guarded by the golden giants of the Adeptus Custodes. No one, not even the High Lords, truly entered the Sanctum Imperialis. This was an auxiliary chamber, a chapel of the void, a psychoconductive nexus known as the Chamber of the Bound. It was a cavern so vast that its ceiling was lost in an artificially generated night sky where constellations of arcane sigils flickered. The floor was a mosaic of circuits etched in gold and silver, pulsing with a power that made their teeth vibrate. And everywhere in rows stretching to the vanishing point were the stations. They were not chairs, they were thrones of torment, skeletal frameworks of blackened iron and copper, bristling with cables, psychic amplifiers, and dampening coils. Each one was a lightning rod designed to attract channel and survive a sliver of divinity. The initiates were herded one by one to their assigned stations. There was no resistance. They were too weak, too indoctrinated, too terrified. 7741 Delta was guided into the cold metal embrace of her station. Restraints slick with ritual oils snapped shut around her wrists, ankles, and forehead. A nest of glittering needle-thin wires descended from an armature, above gently, almost lovingly pressing against her shaven scalp. This then was the altar. They sat a forest of white-robed sacrifices facing the source. They could not see him. He was a myth, a legend, a god enthroned in a sealed chamber beyond comprehension. But they felt him. If the Astronomicon was a sun, this was the galaxy. It was a mind so vast, so powerful, that it defied all metaphor. It was an ocean of liquid fire, a mountain range of pure, crystallized agony, a consciousness that spanned 10,000 years of unceasing, brutal, galaxy-wide war. It was the mind of the master of mankind, and it was a raging, broken, and utterly indomitable thing. It was a consciousness that was simultaneously fighting a billion battles on a billion fronts in the Imperium, holding back the tide of demonic gods that clawed at the fabric of reality. It was a mind that was also a lighthouse, projecting its burning, life-giving agony across the stars. It was a mind that felt every single ship in the Imperium, every astropath, every one of its sons. And it was a mind in the most profound, unending, and unimaginable pain. To feel it, even this distant echo was to be annihilated. It was a pressure that should have crushed their skulls like eggshells boiled the fluid in their spines. Their 10 years of training their mental fortresses were nothing. They were a grain of sand trying to comprehend the desert. This was the God Emperor, and he was not a benevolent pastoral god. He was a furnace of will, a deity of necessity and war, and his gaze was a fire that burned away all that was weak. Above them, on great suspended platforms, the Masters of the Right. The true senior adepts of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica began the ceremony. They were no longer human. They were ancient withered things fused permanently into complex consoles of bone, crystal, and brass. They were part machine, part corpse, their own psychic essence given over to managing this terrible, holy transaction. They did not speak. They did not chant. They acted. In perfect, terrible unison, the Masters of the Right raised their skeletal bionic arms. They became the conductors of the symphony. Open them, they commanded not in voice, but as a single devastating psychic command that struck all the initiates at once. The wires on 7741 Delta's scalp glowed. The arcane machinery of her station whined to life. Her mind, so carefully emptied, so starved and purified, was seized, held fast, and pried open. The last innermost sanctum of her being, the tiny hard kernel of her eye that had survived the Scholastia, was exposed raw and screaming to the void. Behold the master of mankind, the adepts declared. And they threw the switch. A torrent of pure liquid golden power slammed into 7741 Delta. There was no thought. There was no time. There was only the fire. Her consciousness was not touched. It was obliterated. It was vaporized in a nanosecond, consumed, and instantly agonizingly remade. She was no longer 7741 Delta. She was a single screaming nerve ending in the mind of a god. She felt it all. She felt the unending agony of a body kept alive for 10 millennia, a rotting skeletal corpse bound to a life support throne. She felt the crushing planetary weight of his will, the only thing holding the demonic hordes of chaos at bay, a duty that could never, ever be lessened. She felt his roaring, incandescent hatred for the traitor, the heretic, the alien. She felt his terrible, possessive, and utterly impersonal love for humanity, a love that saw 1 billion deaths as a tragic but necessary statistic. She heard the screams of the 10,000 psychers sacrificed that very day to the Golden Throne, their souls burning like magnesium flares, and she felt the Emperor's mind consume them, not with malice, but with a desperate, terrible hunger. This was not a blessing. This was not an infusion of grace. It was a branding. It was a psychic nuclear event. The raw, unfiltered, godlike power of the Emperor stormed the gates of her soul. It was a force so violent, so utterly alien and vast, that it tore her very essence apart. Her soul was ripped open, shredded into its constituent screaming parts. And then the power welded her back together. It was a forge heat, a solar flare, that cauterized what it had just torn. It burned a new, permanent and undeniable thing into the very core of her being. It was a scar. A great golden, agonizing scar that pulsed with the Emperor's own light. It was a circuit. It was a chain. This was the soul binding. Her soul was no longer her own. It was marked. It was bound to his will, chained forever to the terrible, burning light of the Golden Throne. She was now a part of its network. She was an antenna, forcibly, brutally, and permanently attuned to his frequency. The process was a violation so profound that it transcended the very concept of self. She had been hollowed out and refilled with a fire that was not hers, a fire that would burn her for the rest of her life. This was the birth of an astropath, and it was the death of thousands. The chamber of the bound was also a charnel house. The soul binding was not a precise science. It was a brutal industrial process, and the failure rate was catastrophic. To 77411 Delta's left, the initiate in the next station, a pale boy who had been a quiet presence in the Scholastia, simply detonated, his mind unable to contain the influx, shattered. For a single horrifying second, the divine power was twisted, corrupted by his breaking psyche. He became a lens for the wrong thing. A scream that was not human tore from his throat as his flesh melted, sloughing off his bones like hot wax, his body dissolving into a bubbling, psychic-infused slurry that was instantly incinerated by the station's fail-safes. To her right, a young woman convulsed violently. Her eyes, which should have been closed, snapped open, revealing not pupils, but twin orbs of pure, white-hot light. She did not explode. She combusted. A column of golden fire erupted from her mouth. As her soul was consumed, her body flash incinerated into a brittle, blackened carbon statue, still locked in a final silent scream. All across the vast chamber, the culling was taking place. Rows upon rows of initiates were dying. They were evaporating. Their heads exploded. Their bodies were crushed by the psychic pressure, reduced to bloody pulp in their restraints. Their minds, unable to bend, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, the psychic shrapnel instantly consumed by the overwhelming presence of the Emperor. This was the price. For every single initiate who survived the Binding Nine, 9 other fortunate souls who had already survived the Black Ships and the Great Culling were annihilated. They were the dross, the failed experiments, the slag burned away in the divine forge. Their lives, their decade of torment and training were expended in a single agonizing second, their ashes barely registering before they were scoured away by unseen systems. M7401 Delta did not die. She had been taught to be nothing. She had been taught to be an empty vessel. And in the face of annihilation, she did not fight. She did not resist. She did not even bend. She shattered into pure, absolute obedience. She gave up everything. Her fear, her pain, her last shred of memory. She became a perfect hollow vacuum, and the fire of the Emperor rushed through her, finding no resistance, no eye to burn, no will to oppose it. It poured through the emptiness of her soul, burned the golden circuit of the binding into her, and passed on. By becoming nothing, she had survived. Slowly, agonizingly, the torrent of power receded. It did not vanish. It would never vanish. But the overwhelming, soul-destroying surge lessened, pulling back, leaving her only with the constant burning background roar of the Astronomicon, a sound that was now permanently, inextricably part of her. Her body was a ruin. She was slumped in the restraints, trembling violently, a thin line of bloody foam on her lips. She was alive. She was Initiate 7741 Delta. She was bound. By the end of this period, they were ghosts, skeletons draped in stark, white sacrificial robes. They were so weak they could barely stand. Their minds, starved, scoured, and worn down by endless prayer, were defenseless. Their black iron fortresses were gone, replaced by a trembling, expectant emptiness. They were ready. Thousands of them, a ghostly crowd in white, were herded into one final waiting room. It was a vast white marble hall, cold and sterile. There was no furniture, no windows, only the white walls, and at one end a single colossal brass gate, towering high, sealed with the sigils of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the Inquisition. They sat in absolute silence. This silence was worse than the screaming. With their minds bare, unwalled, every initiate was an open wound. They could feel the pure, unadulterated terror of the person sitting next to them. The room was a silent, psychic chorus of abject horror. They knew what was next. They had been taught the statistics as part of their doctrine. They knew that many of them, perhaps most, would not survive the next hour. They knew that the blessing they were about to receive was a fire that would incinerate them from within. They were not waiting for salvation. They were not waiting for glory. They were waiting for a judgment by fire. Some trembled uncontrollably. Some murmured the last of their litanies, their cracked lips moving without conscious thought. Some just stared at the brass gate, their faces a blank mask of programmed acceptance. 7741 Delta sat immobile. She had mastered her fear. She had turned it into emptiness. She was a cup ready to be filled. She felt no hope nor despair. She felt only the waiting, the profound tension before the final moment of transformation or annihilation. After an eternity of silence, a jarring metallic screech echoed through the hall, the sound of immense heavy metal grinding against stone. The great brass gate was beginning to open. Beyond it was not light. It was a heat. A golden, invisible psychic heat washing over their faces, carrying with it the roar of 1 billion souls. It was time. The great brass gates were fully open. They revealed not a room, but a void that pulsed with golden, agonizing light. The heat was not a temperature. It was a psychic wave, a physical crushing presence that forced the very air from their lungs. The roar of the Astronomicon, which they had heard in the Chamber of Resonance, was a distant echo compared to this. This was the sound of the furnace itself. This was the heartbeat of the Imperium, a sledgehammer blow resonating 1,000 times a second. Forward, the adepts commanded their voices barely audible over the psychic din. Initiate 7741 Delta, along with the thousands of other white-robed, emaciated candidates, walked. They did not march. They shuffled a ghostly procession of the damned, stepping from the cold, white marble of the waiting hall into the very heart of the storm. This was not the throne room. That sacred final place was kilometers distant, shielded by adamantium blast doors 100 meters thick, guarded by the golden giants of the Adeptus Custodes. No one, not even the High Lords, truly entered the Sanctum Imperialis. This was an auxiliary chamber, a chapel of the void, a psychoconductive nexus known as the Chamber of the Bound. It was a cavern so vast that its ceiling was lost in an artificially generated night sky, where constellations of arcane sigils flickered. The floor was a mosaic of circuits etched in gold and silver, pulsing with a power that made their teeth vibrate. And everywhere in rows stretching to the vanishing point were the stations. They were not chairs. They were thrones of torment, skeletal frameworks of blackened iron and copper, bristling with cables, psychic amplifiers, and dampening coils. Each one was a lightning rod designed to attract channel and survive a sliver of divinity. The initiates were herded one by one to their assigned stations. There was no resistance. They were too weak, too indoctrinated, too terrified. 741 Delta was guided into the cold metal embrace of her station. Restraints slick with ritual oils snapped shut around her wrists, ankles, and forehead. A nest of glittering needle-thin wires descended from an armature, above gently, almost lovingly pressing against her shaven scalp. This then was the altar. They sat a forest of white-robed sacrifices facing the source. They could not see him. He was a myth, a legend, a god enthroned in a sealed chamber beyond comprehension. But they felt him. If the Astronomicon was a sun, this was the galaxy. It was a mind so vast, so powerful, that it defied all metaphor. It was an ocean of liquid fire, a mountain range of pure, crystallized agony, a consciousness that spanned 10,000 years of unceasing, brutal, galaxy-wide war. It was the mind of the master of mankind, and it was a raging, broken, and utterly indomitable thing. It was a consciousness that was simultaneously fighting a billion battles on a billion fronts in the Imperium, holding back the tide of demonic gods that clawed at the fabric of reality. It was a mind that was also a lighthouse projecting its burning, life-giving agony across the stars. It was a mind that felt every single ship in the Imperium, every astropath, every one of its sons. And it was a mind in the most profound, unending, and unimaginable pain. To feel it, even this distant echo was to be annihilated. It was a pressure that should have crushed their skulls like eggshells boiled the fluid in their spines. Their 10 years of training, their mental fortresses, were nothing. They were a grain of sand trying to comprehend the desert. This was the god Emperor, and he was not a benevolent pastoral god. He was a furnace of will, a deity of necessity and war, and his gaze was a fire that burned away all that was weak. Above them, on great suspended platforms, the Masters of the Right. The true senior adepts of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica began the ceremony. They were no longer human. They were ancient withered things fused permanently into complex consoles of bone, crystal, and brass. They were part machine, part corpse, their own psychic essence given over to managing this terrible, holy transaction. They did not speak. They did not chant. They acted. In perfect, terrible unison, the Masters of the Right raised their skeletal bionic arms. They became the conductors of the symphony. Open them, they commanded, not in voice, but as a single devastating psychic command that struck all the initiates at once. The wires on 7741 Delta's scalp glowed. The arcane machinery of her station whined to life. Her mind, so carefully emptied, so starved and purified, was seized, held fast, and pried open. The last innermost sanctum of her being, the tiny hard kernel of her eye that had survived the Scholastia, was exposed raw and screaming to the void. "Behold the master of mankind," the adepts declared, and they threw the switch. A torrent of pure, liquid, golden power slammed into 7741 Delta. There was no thought. There was no time. There was only the fire. Her consciousness was not touched. It was obliterated. It was vaporized in a nanosecond, consumed, and instantly agonizingly remade. She was no longer 7741 Delta. She was a single screaming nerve ending in the mind of a god. She felt it all. She felt the unending agony of a body kept alive for 10 millennia, a rotting skeletal corpse bound to a life support throne. She felt the crushing planetary weight of his will, the only thing holding the demonic hordes of chaos at bay, a duty that could never, ever be lessened. She felt his roaring, incandescent hatred for the traitor, the heretic, the alien. She felt his terrible, possessive, and utterly impersonal love for humanity, a love that saw a billion deaths as a tragic but necessary statistic. She heard the screams of the 10,000 psychers sacrificed that very day to the golden throne, their souls burning like magnesium flares, and she felt the Emperor's mind consume them, not with malice, but with a desperate, terrible hunger. This was not a blessing. This was not an infusion of grace. It was a branding. It was a psychic nuclear event. The raw, unfiltered, godlike power of the Emperor stormed the gates of her soul. It was a force so violent, so utterly alien and vast, that it tore her very essence apart. Her soul was ripped open, shredded into its constituent screaming parts. And then the power welded her back together. It was a forge heat, a solar flare, that cauterized what it had just torn. It burned a new, permanent and undeniable thing into the very core of her being. It was a scar, a great golden, agonizing scar that pulsed with the Emperor's own light. It was a circuit. It was a chain. This was the soul binding. Her soul was no longer her own. It was marked. It was bound to his will, chained forever to the terrible, burning light of the Golden Throne. She was now a part of its network. She was an antenna forcibly, brutally, and permanently attuned to his frequency. The process was a violation so profound that it transcended the very concept of self. She had been hollowed out and refilled with a fire that was not hers, a fire that would burn her for the rest of her life. This was the birth of an astropath. And it was the death of thousands. The Chamber of the Bound was also a charnel house. The soul binding was not a precise science. It was a brutal industrial process, and the failure rate was catastrophic. To 7741 Delta's left, the initiate in the next station, a pale boy who had been a quiet presence in the Scholastia, simply detonated. His mind, unable to contain the influx, shattered. For a single horrifying second, the divine power was twisted, corrupted by his breaking psyche. He became a lens for the wrong thing. A scream that was not human tore from his throat as his flesh melted, sloughing off his bones like hot wax, his body dissolving into a bubbling, psychic-infused slurry that was instantly incinerated by the station's fail-safes. To her right, a young woman convulsed violently. Her eyes, which should have been closed, snapped open, revealing not pupils, but twin orbs of pure, white-hot light. She did not explode. She combusted. A column of golden fire erupted from her mouth as her soul was consumed. Her body flash incinerated into a brittle, blackened carbon statue, still locked in a final, silent scream. All across the vast chamber, the culling was taking place. Rows upon rows of initiates were dying. They were evaporating. Their heads exploded. Their bodies were crushed by the psychic pressure, reduced to bloody pulp in their restraints. Their minds, unable to bend, shattered into a million pieces, the psychic shrapnel instantly consumed by the overwhelming presence of the Emperor. This was the price. For every single initiate who survived the Binding Nine, nine other fortunate souls who had already survived the black ships and the great culling were annihilated. They were the dross, the failed experiments, the slag burned away in the divine forge. Their lives, their decade of torment and training were expended in a single agonizing second, their ashes barely registering before they were scoured away by unseen systems. 7741 Delta did not die. She had been taught to be nothing. She had been taught to be an empty vessel. And in the face of annihilation, she did not fight. She did not resist. She did not even bend. She shattered into pure, absolute obedience. She gave up everything. Her fear, her pain, her last shred of memory. She became a perfect hollow vacuum. And the fire of the Emperor rushed through her, finding no resistance, no eye to burn, no will to oppose it. It poured through the emptiness of her soul, burned the golden circuit of the binding into her, and passed on. By becoming nothing, she had survived. Slowly, agonizingly, the torrent of power receded. It did not vanish. It would never vanish. But the overwhelming, soul-destroying surge lessened, pulling back, leaving her only with the constant burning background roar of the Astronomicon, a sound that was now permanently, inextricably part of her. Her body was a ruin. She was slumped in the restraints, trembling violently, a thin line of bloody foam on her lips. She was alive. She was Initiate 7741 Delta. She was bound. Consciousness returned, not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent chemical surge. An automated injector part of the station's mechanisms flooded 7741 Delta's system with stimulants forcing her heart to beat and her lungs to draw breath. The first sensation was pain, not the transcendent, soul-tearing agony of the binding, but a localized physical and shockingly intense pain that was centered of all places in her eyes. She tried to open them. She could not. She felt the restraints on her limbs click open, and her weak, trembling body slumped forward. She was still strapped at the chest, but her head was free. She raised a shaking hand, her fingers thin as a bird's claws touching her face. There was nothing there. Where her eyes had been, there were only two deep, hollow, puckered sockets. The flesh was seared, cauterized from the inside out. The divine golden fire of the soul binding pouring through her neural pathways had used her optic nerves as a primary conduit, and in doing so had boiled them along with her eyeballs in their sockets. The searing, localized pain was the feeling of her own flesh, still cooling her nerve endings, screaming their last agonizing report of their own annihilation. She was blind. Utterly, irrevocably, physically blind. She tried to scream, but only a dry, rattling gasp came out. This was it. This was the mark of her new station. A cold, new and final terror seized her. She was in a dark, cold, unknown place, surrounded by the echoes of death, and now she was trapped in a new, permanent personal darkness. The blackness was absolute. She could not even tell if the vast chamber was lit or not. There was no up, no down, only the feeling of the cold metal against her skin and the terrible, searing void where her vision had once been. This was the eternal night. And then she saw. It was not a conscious act. As the last vestigial signals of her physical sight died, a new and terrible sense flared to life, forced open by the same power that had destroyed her eyes. Her third eye, the inner vision of the psyker, was no longer a half-felt intuition. It was now her only sense of sight. She did not see light. She did not see shapes or colors. She saw souls. She looked at her own hand, the one still pressed to her ruined face. She could not see the skin, the bone, the dirt under her nails. Instead, she saw a faint, trembling, bluish-white aura, a fragile, web-like construct of energy. It was her. It was the weak spiritual echo of her own life force. She looked out into the vast, dark chamber. It was no longer dark. It was a swirling, nauseating ocean of new information. The air itself was thick with the residue of the ritual, a glittering golden and deeply painful static that hung in the air like radioactive dust. This, she knew instinctively, was the echo of the Emperor's power, the scar of the soul binding. And she saw the others. They were not people. They were lights. All around her she saw the flickering, unsteady flames of the other survivors. Hundreds of them. Each one was a weak, pale, white-gold candle, trembling in the psychic storm. She could see their fear not on their faces, but as a faint, grayish-black halo of cold energy that clung to them. She could feel the thrumming, agonizing pulse of the new golden scar that had been burned into the core of each of them, a brand of power that pulsed in perfect, terrible synchronicity with her own. And she saw the dead. She looked at the station to her right, where the woman had combusted. There was no light. There was no soul. There was only a cold, dark, empty space, a void where a person had been. It was a hole in the fabric of the psychic world. She looked to her left, where the boy had detonated. She saw something worse, a stain. A dark, oily, purplish-black smear on the psychic landscape, a residue of the brief, terrible corruption that had torn him apart. It was a patch of wrongness that her new sight recoiled from. The vast chamber was a graveyard of these empty voids and foul stains, a checkerboard of the living and the utterly annihilated. This was how she would see the universe from now on, not as a world of matter, but as a world of souls' echoes and the terrifying empty spaces left behind. Her new sight turned inward. She felt the full extent of the damage. The binding had not just taken her eyes, it had ravaged her body. The divine fire had surged through her, using her nervous system as its wiring. The result was catastrophic. Her hair, which had been shaven, would never grow back. The follicles were dead, burned clean. Her muscles, already weak from fasting, had been ravaged, consumed as biological fuel for the psychic event. They were atrophied, withered. She was skeletal, a thing of sticks and parchment skin. Her nerves were permanently damaged, a network of frayed, scorched wires. She trembled not from cold, but from a constant low-level signal of pain, a tremor that would never, ever leave her. Her entire body felt like a limb that had fallen asleep, prickling with a pins and needles agony that was now her baseline state of existence. She was frail. She was fragile. She was a ruin. The robust, if small, child from the agri-world was gone. The disciplined, hardened initiate was gone. In her place was this a blinded, withered, trembling skeletal thing. A tool that had been through the fire and had come out warped, brittle, and forever scarred. A new set of servitors, these ones, medical, glided into the chamber. They were not human, and they had no souls she could see. They were just cold, moving voids, shapes of metal and programmed instinct. One of them approached 7741 Delta. Its metal claws, gentle now, unclipped her from the station. She tried to stand. Her legs, atrophied and racked with nerve damage, instantly buckled. She collapsed onto the psychoconductive floor, a heap of white robes and trembling limbs. The servitor did not pause. It simply grabbed her by the arm, its grip impersonal and bruising, and dragged her. She was dragged along with the other survivors, some crawling, some being dragged like her, none of them walking out of the chamber of the bound. They were taken to a new, sterile white room. The wounded, weeping, newborn Astropaths. She lay on the cold floor, the world a swirling, confusing, and terrifying panorama of soul light, pain static, and empty voids. She had survived. She had paid the price. She was blind, and for the first time she could truly see. They spent weeks or perhaps months' time was a meaningless concept in the windowless, artificially lit infirmaries recovering. Or more accurately, acclimating. There was no recovery from what had been done to them. 7741 Delta, now given the designation Astropath Primaris, lay on a hard, sterile cot. Her body was slowly, painfully knitting itself back together, fed by nutrient drips that tasted like chemical ash. The constant low-level thrum of nerve damage remained a tremor in her hands that would be her companion for life, but the physical pain was nothing. It was the sight that threatened to drive her mad. Her new world was a cacophony of raw, unfiltered psychic information. In the Scholastia, she had been taught to build a fortress. Now her fortress was a ruin, its gates permanently blown open, and she was forced to live in the rubble while a hurricane raged around her. She saw everything. She saw the adept who brought their nutrient rations, and his soul was not a simple light. It was a murky, grayish-yellow aura, choked with the psychic smell of petty pride, a deep, abiding contempt for them, and a gnawing, secret fear of his own superiors. The emotions wafted from him like heat, and they were suffocating. She saw the medical servitor that changed her drip, and it was a terrifying walking void. A cold, black, empty shape that her mind instinctively recoiled from a patch of absolute nothingness that had no right to move. And she saw the walls. The very stones of the infirmary were saturated with the echoes of the past. She could see the faint, fading psychic stains of the thousands of initiates who had been in this room before her, the residue of their terror, their pain, and their despair. It was like living inside a house whose walls were perpetually screaming. The first lessons of this new life were not about power. They were about survival. "You are infants," a new instructor told them. This one was an astropath herself, an ancient, withered woman whose own ruined eye sockets were covered by a black silk sash. Her mental voice was not a voice at all, but a series of cold, precise, projected concepts, that simply appeared in their minds, sharp as glass. You see the world as it is, a thin, fragile skin of reality stretched over an ocean of eternal madness. You see the Imperium. It is the static that fills your vision. It is the screaming you hear when there is no sound. It is the thing that is always looking back at you. The initiates were assembled in a darkened room, sitting on the floor. Your lesson is to filter. You must learn to separate the real from the echo. The instructor pointed a skeletal finger at a corner of the room. Look. 7741 Delta looked. She saw a faint human-shaped aura huddled in the corner, weeping. It was a pale blue light, pulsing with a cold, desperate sadness. What is this? The instructor's mind voice demanded. A soul, 7741 Delta projected her first clumsy attempt. The concept was messy, tinged with her own fear. Wrong. The instructor's correction was a spike of mental pain. That is an echo, a psychic residue. The initiate who died in that spot 3 days ago. His despair was so great it stained the very fabric of the room. It is a ghost, but it is not a spirit. It is a memory. It has no will. It is nothing. You will learn to see it as the stain it is and ignore it. Or you will spend your life babbling at shadows. They were taught to build new walls, not the thick black iron walls of the Scholastia designed to keep everything out, but filters, veils, psychic membranes that would allow them to function without being overwhelmed. They learned to dim their sight, to turn the roaring cacophony of auras and echoes into a manageable muted background hum, allowing them to focus only on the now. Then came the second, more terrible lesson, learning the language. You are the heralds, the instructor projected. You are the voice of the Emperor, but you have no voice. You will learn the lingua astropathica. This was not speech. Speech was a clumsy physical act of moving air. This was the projection of pure conceptual thought, hurled directly from one mind to another across the impossible gulf of the warp. You will not send words. The instructor explained, her mind voice sharp with impatience, as an initiate failed, projecting only a jumble of static-filled fear. Words are containers. Fire, fleet, traitor. They are meaningless. You will send the idea itself. You will send the concept of heat, of burning, of consuming flame. You will send the image of 1,000 void ships, their guns blazing. You will send the raw, undiluted emotion of betrayal. They practiced in pairs. 7741 Delta sat opposite another survivor, a gaunt young man whose soul light flickered with a constant nervous tremor. Their task to send the concept of red. 7741 Delta focused. She tried to think the word, but it did nothing. She tried to picture the color, but it was a weak, faint image. No. The instructor's mind voice lashed them. Do not picture it. Feel it. Feel the blood in your veins. Feel the heat of a forge. Feel the anger of a blow. Feel the red of the litany of hate. Now. Push. 77401 Delta dredged up the memory of the rust-colored fields of her homeworld, the color of Hask's rage, the red of the blood on the floor of the Scholastia. She gathered all these feelings, bundled them into a single, dense psychic packet, and then, with a lurch of mental effort that made her head spin and her nose bleed, she hurled it at the young man. He flinched, his hands flying to his ruined eyes. Blood. He projected his thought form, a burst of panic. I see blood. Good. The instructor's mind voice stated the concept, tinged with the barest hint of approval. You sent red. He received blood. It is crude. It is imprecise. But it is a start. You will practice until you can send the concept of a specific shade of red, and he will receive it untainted by your filthy emotional memories. They spent endless cycles practicing, their minds growing raw and sore as if they were flexing a new atrophied muscle. They learned to encode tactical data astrogation charts and entire volumes of the Imperial Creed into these dense, symbolic, emotional, conceptual packets. But one question remained. A silent, terrified scream in all their minds. If the warp was a raging ocean of demons and their minds were now permanently open, why were they not instantly devoured? Why had the things from the black ship not consumed them? The ancient instructor sensed their collective question. She let them feel her contempt, a feeling like cold, spoiled oil. Because you are branded fools. She amplified their awareness of the one thing they had been trying to ignore, the soul binding. It was not just a scar, it was a chain. A living, golden and agonizing chain of psychic energy that was fused to the very core of their souls. 7741 Delta focused on it, and the pain of it flared a constant, sharp, golden pull. That, the instructor projected, is your leash. It is the mark of the Master. The fire of the Emperor that burned you has claimed you. You are his property, his tools, his hounds. When the predators of the Imperium smell your soul, they do not just smell a tasty, terrified mortal. They smell him. They smell the anathema. They smell the golden fire of the one being they truly fear. The golden chain was their anchor. It was the only thing that held them in reality. It was what allowed them to open their minds to the warp, to scream their messages into the storm, and not be instantly ripped apart and carried away. He does not protect you out of love. The instructor concluded, her mind voice utterly devoid of comfort. He protects you as a craftsman protects his hammer. You are useful. The moment you cease to be useful, or the moment your will falters, and you let the enemy in that chain will be your damnation. 7X741 Delta sat on her cot, her body trembling, her nose still trickling blood from the exertion of the lesson. She was blind. She was a ruin. She was a slave bound by a golden burning chain to a dying, screaming god. And she was a vital component in the survival of the Imperium. She closed her new inner eyes, filtering out the screaming walls and the grey auras of the adepts. She focused on the young man opposite her. She gathered her will not with anger or fear, but with the cold, hard, empty discipline that had saved her life. She fashioned a single perfect, unadulterated concept. It was the concept of her 10 years of training, of the purging of her name, of her new reality. She pushed. The young man received it. His soul light flickered, and he projected back a single shared concept of understanding. The word she had sent, the first word she had ever spoken in the true lingua Astropathica, was obedience. Their graduation was not a ceremony, it was an inventory transfer. One day the lessons simply stopped. The instructors, those ancient withered astropaths who had drilled them in the new, terrible language of the soul, did not appear. Instead, a new set of figures entered the sterile white chambers. They were not telepaths. They were adepts of the administratum, their grey, ink-stained robes starkly different from the black silks and sacrificial whites of the Astropathica. They carried data slates and branding irons. The newly bound Astropaths, 72741 Delta among them, were lined up. They were no longer initiates. They were assets. Asset 7741 Delta, one of the scribes, intoned his voice, a dull monotone. He did not look at her, only at his slate. Designation Astropath Primaris Grade 7th. Purity confirmed. Binding stable. Deployment Segmentum Obscurus Battlefleet. Gothic Relay Station Oculus the Thene. He looked up, not at her face, but at her shoulder. Present the mark. A servitor, its flesh clammy and cold, shoved 7741 Delta forward and tore the white robe from her shoulder, exposing her pale skeletal flesh. The scribe checked his slate again, then picked up a small electro-brand. It hummed, the tip glowing with a faint blue light. With a hiss of burning flesh and the smell of ozone, he pressed the brand into her skin. It was not a holy sigil, it was not a badge of honor, it was a serial number. A complex barcode of imperial Gothic numerals and cog sigils that marked her as property, catalogued her designation, and finalized her deployment. She was now officially a piece of imperial equipment. 7741 Delta did not flinch. The pain was a dull, distant throb compared to the constant golden fire of the soul binding that was her new reality. One by one, they were processed, stamped, catalogued. Asset 8820 Epsilon. Designation Astropath Secundus. Binding faint. Deployment Agri-World Sophos 7th replacement for expired unit. Asset 40501 Theta. Designation Astropath Primaris. Binding strong. Deployment Inquisitorial Storm Cruiser Judgment's Anvil. Each one was given a destination. A forge world in need of a new psychic link. An Imperial Guard regiment embarking on a crusade. A lonely, isolated relay station on the edge of the void. They were not asked. They were assigned their fates dictated by a logistical algorithm calculated by the soulless machine minds of the Administratum. The process of shipping them was no different from their arrival, save for one crucial detail: they were now valuable. They were not thrown into a lightless hold with thousands of others guarded by the soulless Sisters of Silence. Instead, they were treated as fragile, critical, and extremely dangerous cargo. 7741 Delta, along with a dozen other astropaths bound for the same sector, was led to a transport vessel. But they did not walk the grand corridors. They were taken to the cargo decks to a specialized shielded vault. She was placed inside a cold, coffin-like pod. It was padded, but the padding was stark utilitarian. A new set of restraints, softer but no less final, clicked into place. A web of nutrient tubes and waste pipes was attached. She was in effect being put into stasis, but not a full one. Her mind was to be kept dormant, quiet, but alive. The voyages long, the Administratum scribe told them, his voice echoing from a voxcaster outside their pods. You are not to attempt contact. You are not to see. You are not to think. You are a package. Your function will begin upon delivery. The pod sealed. Darkness. But this darkness was different from the simple blackness of the hold on the black ship. She was alone, in a box, blind. But she could still see with her third eye. She saw the other astropaths in their own pods, faint, flickering, terrified lights lined up like torpedoes in a rack. She felt the ship's engines ignite a deep material thrum. And then she felt the sickening, non-physical lurch as the ship tore a hole in reality and entered the warp. It was the same journey, but her new open mind experienced it in a billion new agonizing shades of terror. She was a beacon, and she was in a box. The things outside were instantly aware of her. They swarmed the ship, drawn to the pinpricks of soul-bound light. She could hear them, their whispers no longer vague temptations, but clear, precise, and utterly blasphemous promises, slithering against the hull of her pod. And she felt the chain, the golden burning leash of the soul binding. It held her fast, an anchor in the storm. But it chafed. The presence of the demonic entities pulled at it, and the chain pulled back, and the friction was an agony in the very center of her being. She did not scream. She did not panic. She did as she was told. She made her mind small, hid behind the burning shield of her new master, and became, as instructed, a package. She was no longer a child. She was no longer an initiate. She was freight. She was a weapon in a crate, a tool in a box being shipped to the front line, indistinguishable from the crates of laser guns and rations in the hold next to her. Relay Station Oculus III was not a planet. It was a rock, a hollowed-out asteroid adrift in the cold, black void, its surface bristling with vox antennae and defensive macro cannons. Its only purpose was to listen and to scream. 7741 Delta was uncrated from her pod and taken, her body still weak from the journey to the heart of the station. This was the choir chamber. It was a perfect sphere, a vast hollow globe of black, resonant copper dug deep into the rock. The air was frigid, kept just above freezing to help focus the mind and cool the arcane machinery. The only light came from the dim, flickering blue-green glow of the apparatus itself, and it was full. Dozens of other astropaths were here. Like her, they were skeletal, withered figures, permanently wired into complex, throne-like harnesses that crucified them against the curved copper walls. Nutrient tubes, waste pipes, and data links snaked from their bodies, feeding them, cleansing them and monitoring their every biological sign. They were blind, their eye sockets hollow, sewn shut, or masked by silk bands. They were the living components of a biological machine. 7741 Delta was led to her own vacant harness. It was cold, the metal unforgiving against her thin robes. As the adept strapped her in, she felt the cold, familiar click of the restraints, the prick of the nutrient injectors, the damp metallic press of a cranial interface against her shaven scalp. She was now part of the Oculus Threaded Choir. She looked out with her third eye. She saw the other Astropaths not as bodies, but as flickering pale flames, their golden soul-binding scars, pulsing in unison, a chorus of captured light. Her first assignment came immediately. A message packet encoded on a data slate was received by the presiding adept. It was a high-priority request for naval reinforcements from a nearby subsector. A simple message, but it had to cross 500 light B-years, a journey through a notoriously violent stretch of the warp. It would require the power of a full choir. Designates prepare to link the adept's voice flat, and mechanical echoed in the cold chamber. 7741 Delta felt a new psychic connection engage. A circuit. The cranial interface hummed, and her carefully filtered, disciplined mind was suddenly connected. It was not like the Scholastia. This was a full-powered operational link. She felt her consciousness, her eye dissolve. She was no longer 7741 Delta. She was we. She was one with the 50 other Astropaths in the chamber. She felt their minds, their thoughts, their fears, their pain all blending into a single, vast collective consciousness. She felt the ancient, weary resignation of the Astropath who had been here for 50 years. She felt the nervous, sharp-edged terror of a newly assigned Astropath like herself. All of it all, their individualities were submerged, erased, and reforged into a single, unified psychic entity. The choir received the concept the adept commanded. The presiding Astropath Prime, the central conductor of the choir, a being so ancient he was little more than a torso, fused into a throne of crystal, pushed the message packet into the collective. 7741 Delta, we received it. It was not words. It was a block of pure crystallized data astrogation coordinates, ship designations, enemy fleet compositions, and the raw, undiluted, desperate emotion of a world under siege. The vessel is prepared, the adept said. Project. This was the strain. This was the work. The unified mind of the choir. This we drew in a single colossal psychic breath. 7741 Delta felt her own physical body arch in its harness, her muscles spasming, her teeth grinding together so hard she tasted blood. The choir focused. It took that block of data and it shouted. It was a scream of pure, focused, conceptual thought. It was a lance of psychic energy imbued with the full collective power of 50 soul-bound psychers, all amplified by the copper resonant chamber, all anchored by the golden chains of their binding. They hurled this scream, this message out of the station, out of real space, and into the roaring, screaming, hellish ocean of the warp. They aimed it not at a place, but at a feeling. They aimed it at the psychic beacon of the astropathic choir in the target sector, a tiny flickering candle they could barely see across the gulf of madness. The effort was titanic. 7741 Delta felt her own soul energy being drained, siphoned by the link fed into the singular focused scream. It felt like her very life force was being poured out of her, a psychic hemorrhage. The golden scar of her binding burned glowing white hot as it strained, holding her fast against the chaotic tides of the warp that tore at their projected message. She felt the things in the warp notice. The demonic predators, the formless, hungry intelligences. They slammed against the message, trying to intercept it, to corrupt it, to eat it. The choir held. We held. We shielded the concept with our collective burning will, using the Emperor's branded protection as a plow to force the message through the immaterial filth. For a full agonizing minute, the scream was held. 7741 Delta's body convulsed, a thin line of blood trickling from her nose. And then, It was sent. The packet was released, a psychic torpedo fired into the void to travel for weeks, months, or years until it was heard by another choir. The link broke. 7741 Delta's consciousness slammed back into her own withered body. The we was gone. She was I again. She was exhausted. She was a hollowed-out, shaking wreck. Her mind was raw, her body aching, her soul feeling scraped and thin. The chamber was filled with the sound of rasping breaths and quiet, involuntary sobs. "Purge and reset," the adept's voice commanded, utterly unmoved. "Next packet is pending." This was her life now. To be merged, to be erased, to scream into the void, to be torn apart, and to reform over and over until the day she finally burned out. The work was a grinding, soul-destroying routine. Link, receive, scream, collapse, repeat. 7741 Delta's existence became a blur of these cycles, her life measured not in days or years, but in the number of messages she had successfully torn from her own mind and hurled into the void. Each transmission left her weaker, scraping another thin layer from her soul. But the exhaustion was not the true enemy. The true enemy was always listening. The warp was not an empty pipe through which their thoughts traveled. It was a jungle. It was an ocean teeming with predators that dwarfed human comprehension. And every time the choir of Oculus Thumbhine screamed a message, they were a flare of light in that infinite, hungry darkness. They were a drop of blood in shark-infested waters. They called the predators the echo wolves, the mind thieves, the static demons. They were the formless, giggling, hateful intelligences of the Imperium, the very demons they had been warned against, and they were drawn to the soul-bound light like moths to a flame of agony. During a transmission of vital strategic importance, fleet coordinates for a new offensive, it happened. The choir had linked. The we was formed. The concept, a complex, shimmering, multi-layered block of astrogation data, was held in their collective unified mind. "Project," the adept commanded. We screamed. The lance of pure thought, branded with the Emperor's authority, tore through the veil of reality. And something pushed back. It was not the usual psychic static or the mindless roaring of the warp. It was a cold slithering and deeply, anciently intelligent presence. It wrapped itself around their psychic scream like a serpent, its voice a sliver of ice-cold blasphemy injected directly into their collective mind. It did not try to stop the message. It tried to change it. The choir was screaming the coordinates Sector 81 Alpha. The entity, with a sudden, impossible pressure, tried to make them scream Sector 81 Beta. It was a tiny one-word change, a single altered coordinate, a change that would send an entire Imperial battle fleet not into an enemy ambush, but into the heart of an uncharted star, annihilating them all in a single fiery, mistaken instant. The we recoiled. The collective mind of the choir buckled. This was the ultimate terror, not just failing to send a message, but sending the wrong one. Sending a lie that would kill worlds. "Hold the Astropath Prime." The ancient enthroned conductor screamed into their minds, his own psychic voice cracking with the strain. "Hold the concept, purify the line." The choir, the we, rallied. 7741 Delta, along with all the others, poured her will into the fight. They were in a psychic tug-of-war, 51 minds against one ancient and impossibly powerful entity from the depths of the void. They focused on the truth of the message, on the burning golden authority of their soul binding, using the Emperor's brand as a weapon, a searing fire to burn the serpent's lies. The chamber was filled with the sounds of their physical torment. Bodies, including 72741 Deltas, arched and thrashed in their harnesses. Blood black in the dim light poured from their nostrils, their ears, and their ruined, hollow eye sockets. The strain was beyond comprehension. The serpent, enraged, recoiled from the collective's unified golden fire, but it was not defeated. It was a predator, and it had tasted weakness. It found a crack. An astropath near the edge of the sphere, a younger man designated 9021 Rho, had faltered. His will, his contribution to the we, flickered. He had been terrified, his mind dwelling not on the message, but on the horror of the entity itself. In that nanosecond of broken concentration, the serpent struck. 7741 Delta, still linked, felt it. She felt 921 Row's mind, his part of the we suddenly vanish. It was not the silence of a failed transmission. It was a new, terrible sound. It was a psychic scream of a kind she had never heard before, a sound of a soul being unmade and remade, a wet, tearing, triumphant noise. The collective link was instantly violently severed by the Astropath Prime. Breach node 34, purge now. 7741 Delta's consciousness slammed back into her body, leaving her gasping, her heart hammering. The chamber was plunged into screaming alarms and flashing crimson emergency lights. She turned her third eye toward 921 Row. His soul light was gone. The pale, flickering white gold flame was extinguished. In its place was a churning, pulsating, rapidly expanding vortex of oily, purple-black wrongness. The entity had poured itself into him. He was no longer a man. He was a gate. His body, his physical body, tore itself free from the harness, the metal restraints snapping like twigs. He stood impossibly on the curved copper wall, his head thrown back. He was laughing. It was a sound that was not a laugh, a sound that came from 1,000 throats at once. "We are free!" He gurgled a voice that was not his as his jaw unhinged and a sickly non-light began to pour from his open mouth. A heavy armored door slammed open. A team of flame-wielding purity servitors, their tanks emblazoned with the skulls of the Inquisition, marched in. They did not hesitate. For the Emperor, the presiding adept shrieked. The servitors opened fire. A torrent of consecrated burning promethium engulfed the laughing Astropath. He screamed a sound that echoed in both real space and the warp, a shriek of thwarted rage and agony. He was incinerated in seconds, his body reduced to a charred, smoking, and silent husk. The crimson lights died. The alarms ceased. The chamber was silent, save for the gasping sobs of the surviving choir and the smell of burned flesh and ozone. 9221 Row was dead. The breach was sealed. The presiding adept, his voice shaking but cold, reactivated his vox. The transmission failed. The message was corrupted. A new choir will be assembled in 1 hour to resend. 7741 Delta trembled, blood drying on her face. A world afleet would pay the price for their failure. This was the work. This was the horror. The wolves were always at the door. Time ceased to have meaning. There were only the transmissions, the screaming, the links, the brief, gasping moments of individuality, and then the screaming again. Years or perhaps decades passed in this red-black haze of agony and effort. 7741 Delta was no longer a new, terrified asset. She was a veteran, an old worn gear in the great machine, and the machine was wearing her down to nothing, the soul binding. The great golden burning chain that moored her to the Emperor's will had never been a gift. It was a brand. And like a brand seared into a log, it did not just mark, it consumed. It was a psychic battery stamped into her soul, and it had a finite charge. With every transmission, every scream into the void, 7741 Delta had to draw upon its power. With every psychic battle fought against the Echo Wolves, she had to drain a little more of that sacred borrowed fire to keep her mind intact. And the fire was going out. She could feel it. The golden, agonizing scar that pulsed at the core of her being was no longer a roaring, white-hot presence. It was a dull, aching, reddish-gold ember. The constant thrumming pain of its connection was fading, replaced by a new, terrifying sensation, a cold, empty weariness. The link was weakening. The Emperor's fire, the very thing that protected her, was guttering. Her work became harder, the strain more profound. Where she and the we had once punched a hole in the warp with a defiant scream, now it felt like they were pushing against an oppressive heavy tide. It took more effort. It took more of her, and she had less to give. Her third eye, the psychic sight that had replaced her physical vision, began to dim. The auras of the other astropaths, once clear, flickering flames, were now muted, smoky, indistinct shapes, as if she were viewing them through a thick, oily fog. The echoes of the dead, the stains on the wall, were just vague, cold spots. Her own inner light, the power by which she saw the world of souls, was fading. She was going blind all over again, but this time in the one sense that mattered. Her body, long since a ruin, mirrored the decay of her soul. The constant low-level nerve damage that had been a simple tremor was now a full-body palsy. Her limbs shook uncontrollably in their restraints. The adepts had been forced to add new padded clamps to her harness just to stop her from convulsing against the cold copper. Her skin, already pale, was now a translucent waxy grey, stretched so thin over her brittle bones that she looked like a mummified corpse. She was ancient before her time, a hollowed-out, desiccated husk kept alive by nothing more than the whirring of the nutrient pump. She no longer had the strength to be unstrapped. She, like the Astropath Prime she had once looked upon with a mix of terror and awe, was now permanently fused to her station. The harness was her body. Its metal frame was her skeleton. The nutrient tubes were her veins. The waste pipes were her organs. She was a living, dying component. A biological fuse burned almost to the end. She knew with the cold, dull certainty of an animal what this meant. Her power, the only thing that gave her value, was waning. The battery was running low. And in the cold, brutal, efficient calculus of the Imperium, a tool that could no longer perform its function had only one fate. As the golden light of the soul binding faded, the darkness rushed in. For decades, that burning internal chain had been her shield, her anchor, the searing, painful light that burned away the worst of the shadows. But now, it was a dim, flickering ember. And the shadows, the hungry, formless things in the void, were no longer held back. The wolves were no longer at the door. They were in the room. Her fading psychic sight, which had once shown her the truth of souls, now became her personal, inescapable hell. The barrier between reality and illusion, between memory and the present, between the material world and the warp, simply dissolved. It began with the whispers. They were no longer just the howling of the echo wolves during a transmission. They were constant. They were the background noise of her existence. A low, sibilant, multi-tongued murmur that slithered into her mind during the rest cycles. They whispered her old number. They whispered names she had never known. They whispered promises of relief, of an end to the pain of cool water and a dark, quiet sleep. They were lies, but they were comforting. And then she began to see things. Her dimming soul sight started to play tricks. The echo of the long-purged Astropath 9021 row, the one who had become a gate, was no longer just a cold stain. Now she would see him standing in the corner, his soul light flickering, beckoning to her with a charred hand. She would see the ancient, withered Astropath Prime long dead, and replaced still sitting in his throne, his empty sockets looking at her, his mind projecting a silent, repeating scream of pure terror. She heard messages that were not there. Link, the presiding adept's voice, would command, "Receive." And 77401 Delta would receive the message, but it would be wrong. It would be tangled with another one, an echo from a transmission she had sent 20 years ago. A desperate plea from a dying regiment on a world called Vada 4. A message she had screamed out, a message that had she knew arrived too late. Reinforcements. Vada Ava. We are. A voice from 2 decades ago would whisper, overlaying the current critical message about fuel tithes. Silence 77741. Delta. The adept's voice would cut in sharp and cold. You are projecting noise. You are corrupting the link. She couldn't help it. The signals were crossed. The memories were bleeding into the present. She had become a bad receiver, a faulty piece of equipment, her mind filled with the static of her own long, tormented history. She began to speak. It was not a conscious act. Her withered vocal cords, unused for decades, rasped into life. She would loll her head in her harness and mumble, "Sector 81 Alpha. 81 Alpha. Beta. No. No. The serpent. Hold the line." She was reliving her greatest failure, her greatest terror over and over. "Harsk, the field. It's rust-colored. Father, why?" The name, her father's name, a word she had not consciously thought in 40 years, bubbled up from the depths of her broken mind, a piece of psychic driftwood. The adepts hearing the physical noise would check their diagnostic slates, their auras pulsing with annoyance and clinical disdain. Her sleep, the brief, drugged and dreamless oblivion they gave her, was now a place of nightmares. She would scream, a thin, reedy physical sound, her body thrashing against its restraints. She was back on the black ship, the things crawling on the hull. She was back in the chamber of the bound, the fire consuming her. She was broken. This was the inevitable final fate of her kind. Not a clean death in battle, not a noble sacrifice. It was this, a long, slow, inexorable slide into utter babbling madness. The human mind was not meant to be a conduit for the screams of a galaxy for so long. It was a wire that had carried too much current for too long, and now it was melting, fraying, and starting to catch fire. Insanity was not a risk. It was an occupational hazard. It was the final delayed and guaranteed symptom of the soul binding. Her light was fading, and her mind was shattering. The presiding adept's voice cut through the cold air of the choir chamber. The last transmission had failed. It had been corrupted, polluted by her mental static, her incessant phantom whispers of rust fields and serpents bleeding into the data stream. The adept stood before her harness. He did not look at her face. He looked at the small diagnostic panel wired into her life support. A single ominous red rune flashed. Binding failed. The tool was broken. His movements were economical, devoid of emotion. He unholstered the sleek, archaic las pistol at his hip, its casing inlaid with the sigil of the telepathica. The other astropaths in the choir watched with their third eyes. Their own dim, flickering soul lights trembled with a cold, shared terror, but they remained silent. They knew the protocol. In a brief, final, terrifying moment of lucidity, 741 Delta saw his aura. She saw his intent. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was the cold, clean, simple concept of disposal. "Your service is concluded," the adept stated, his voice a flat monotone. He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at the center of her shaven, trembling forehead. "Receive the Emperor's peace." The crack of the shot was sharp and loud in the copper sphere. 7741 Delta's head snapped back against the harness. Her decades-long, agonizing tremor stopped instantly. Her soul light, that faint, smoky, guttering ember, was snuffed out. She was a void. The adept holstered his pistol and made a cold notation on his data slate. Asset expired. 2 medical servitors, their auras, the cold, walking nothingness she had always feared, glided into the chamber. They unclipped the skeletal, mummified corpse from the harness, its withered limbs dangling. They unhooked the tubes, spilling fluid. They dragged her body from the room. She was biological waste destined for the reclamation vats. The station was empty for less than an hour. The door to the choir chamber hissed open. The adept looked up from his console. A new astropath, young, gaunt, and terrified, was shoved inside. She was still in the white sacrificial robes of the Scholastia, a fresh weeping brand on her shoulder. Her ruined eye sockets were bloody. Her soul was a bright, terrified, strong flame. "Asset 9912 Sigma," the adept commanded, his voice impatient. "Station 34 is vacant. You will link. The choir is waiting." This is the arithmetic of the Imperium. It is the grim, unfeeling, and necessary calculus that underpins the survival of 1,000,000 worlds. Think of the child hunted in the rust-colored field. Think of the thousands crammed into the lightless, stinking hold of the black ship. Think of the 9/10ths who were marched unknowing into the rendering chambers to feed the golden throne, their entire agonizing journey culminating in a single, swift, anonymous incineration. Think of the 1 in 10 who survived. the 1 in 10 who were fortunate. Think of the decade of systematic psychic brutalization in the Scholastia Psychona, where their minds were broken, scoured, and reforged into tools of obedience. Think of the Chamber of the Bound, the Heart of the Fire, where 9 out of every 10 of those fortunate survivors were annihilated in a single, golden, agonizing flash. Their souls vaporized, their bodies reduced to carbon statues and greasy psychic stains. This is the tithe. 1 billion are reaped, millions are transported, thousands are judged, hundreds are bound, dozens are deployed. And for what? For this. For the endless, thankless, soul-consuming work. Think of 7741 Delta. Think of the decades she spent crucified in a cold copper sphere, her body withering her mind, dissolving her only purpose to be a single, screaming note in a collective psychic shout. Think of the last bolt that mercifully efficiently ended her function. Now multiply her. Multiply her by the hundreds of thousands of astropaths stationed across the galaxy. Multiply her by the millions who came before, who have already been burned out, purged, or driven insane. Multiply her by the endless weeping river of new bound souls, fresh from the hells of terror being shipped out to replace them. An ocean of suffering. A galaxy-spanning holocaust of the soul so vast it is incomprehensible, so constant it is mundane. This is the fuel. The Imperium is a vast celestial engine, a machine of war and faith that spans the stars. And its fuel is not promethium, not fission, not fusion. Its fuel is the agony of its own children. It is a machine that runs on the liquefied, concentrated, and endlessly replenished suffering of its most cursed and most vital component. Every order given, every fleet movement coordinated, every warning of a Xenos fleet, every tithe-grade confirmation, every single vital non-physical connection that holds the fragile, crumbling edifice of mankind together is bought and paid for with a life. A life of pure, unadulterated, and systematically managed torment. They are the billion candles lit and extinguished in an endless rhythmic cycle, just to keep the darkness at bay for one more second. They are the mortar made of ground-up bone and terror that holds the bricks of the Imperial Palace together. And no one, not the planetary governor whose life is saved by their warning, not the Imperial guardsmen whose reinforcements arrive because of their scream, not even the Inquisitor who uses them as a personal communication device will ever know their name. They are not heroes. They are not martyrs, for a martyr is remembered. They are slag. They are the psychic, spiritual, and physical waste product of a galaxy at war. They are the cost, and that cost is never ever fully paid. On a different relay station, Fulcrum Nix, in the dark of the Segmentum Ultima, an astropath is dying. His designation is 8819 Gammus. He has been in his harness for 63 standard years. He does not remember his name, his world, or what it felt as a child to feel the sun on his face. He is a mummified skeletal thing, his body so atrophied he is little more than a pile of bones in a web of cables, his soul light a guttering, smoky, near-invisible spark. He is at this moment part of a choir linked with 40 others trying to transmit a message. But he is failing. His mind is a ruin, a collapsed city of broken memories and screaming ghosts. He is whispering Vardafuftus and the Serpent just as 7741 Delta did. His part of the we is a broken, static-filled line. He is corrupting the signal. The Astropath Prime, sensing the failure, tries to sever his node to cut him from the collective. But it is too late. 8819 Gammus is not being executed. He is simply expiring. His heart, strained beyond all endurance by the effort, flutters spasms and stops. His physical body goes limp in its harness, and in that infinitesimal silent instant, the soul binding snaps. The golden, burning, agonizing chain that has been his leash, his anchor, and his only protection for his entire adult life vanishes. The presence of the Emperor, that overwhelming, searing, protective fire, is gone. For the first time in 63 years, 8819 Gammus is alone. His shattered, insane mind is suddenly terribly and perfectly lucid. He is himself, and he is naked. He is a single, tiny, flickering, unprotected soul, floating in the infinite, cold, black ocean of the Imperium. And the ocean sees him. The things that have been scratching at the walls of his mind for his entire life, the echo wolves, the mind thieves, the formless, giggling patient hunters of the void, they turn. They see this small, weak, delicious light, a light that was once protected by the searing fire of the anathema, but is now abandoned. It is a meal set free. There is no judgment. There is no afterlife. There is only the rush. 1 billion formless psychic predators descend upon his naked soul. They are on him before he can even formulate a scream. He feels a cold that is beyond all cold, a terror that makes the soul binding feel like a warm embrace. His soul, his eye, his very essence is torn. It is ripped apart, feasted upon, devoured, and dragged piece by screaming piece into the howling, eternal madness of the warp. His death is not an escape. It is not peace. It is not an ending. It is simply the final and most terrible damnation. It is the beginning of a new and eternal form of suffering, one without the mercy of a physical body, to fail one without the hope of an eventual end. It is the fate of all his kind. In the cold, copper-lined choir chamber of Fulcrum 9, a single red light on the Adept's console flashes. The Adept makes a simple gesture. 2 servitors glide forward, their metal claws ready to unclip the newly expired piece of equipment to scour the harness to make it ready. The Astropath Prime, a creature of bone and wire, pauses the transmission. The collective. We disbands its individual minds, crashing back into their ruined bodies, gasping, weeping, trembling. They saw what happened to 8819 Gammas. They all felt that final, tearing, silent scream. They know intimately what awaits every single one of them. The doors to the chamber hiss open. A new young astropath, her white robe stained with her own blood from her ruined eyes, is shoved inside. Asset 0451 Tau. The Adept's voice drones cold, impatient, and utterly unmoved by the tragedy he has just witnessed. Station 12. Connect. The new astropath is strapped into the still warm harness, her soul light a bright, terrified, powerful flame. The Astropath Prime waits. The new node connects. The we is reformed, the terror of the new girl blending with the weary, ancient despair of the veterans. A new collective consciousness is born. The Adept nods. The message is critical. It must be sent. Project. The machine endures. The newly formed choir of Fulcrum 9 takes in a single collective psychic breath. It gathers its will. It focuses on the data, on the target, on the burning golden chains that anchor it to the Emperor's will. And once more from the cold, dark, hollowed-out rock, a single unified and utterly agonizing scream of pure thought tears through the veil, hurling itself into the void. The suffering is the fuel. The sacrifice is endless. The cogs are replaceable. The machine, the Imperium, endures.